Greetings, scholars. We are going to begin our review here of APUSH Unit 17 on Ford, Carter, Reagan, Bush, and Clinton. And I'm looking to my right here at the review sheet, and I'm going to take you from the top to the bottom, starting with President Ford, who took over after Richard Nixon resigned in 1974. Perhaps the most important thing while Jerry Ford is president is the fall of Saigon and the defeat of South Vietnam by the government of North Vietnam in 1975. And this is a failure of the policy of containment. The fall of South Vietnam sees an exodus in the next 20 years of 800,000 refugees, which are called boat people, people who are fleeing from communism. Half of these will immigrate to the United States. The government of Cambodia, next to Vietnam, falls to the Khmer Rouge communists, who proceed to brutally murder, very systematically, 2 million out of the population of 8 million. The government of Laos falls to the Pathet Lao communists in 1975. So communism does spread. It does seem to give truth to the idea of the domino theory. There are some revisionist historians, though, who argue that our holding the line in former Indochina stopped the spread of communism elsewhere, and you have what are called the tiger economies, places like Malaysia and Singapore and Indonesia and the Philippines, whose economies became sort of export-driven and very, very capitalist and very protected from anything resembling communism. So that's sort of a higher-order thinking revisionist interpretation of the disaster. At the time, it shows a total failure of our previous 10 years of trying to fend off the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese army. Jimmy Carter is elected in 1976, promising to bring decency and honesty back to government. That sort of sniff of Richard Nixon still hangs over politics, especially since Gerald Ford gave a pardon to Nixon upon taking office. Under Carter, you have a Supreme Court decision which is very controversial, the Bakke versus the Regents of the University of California. Bakke is an engineering student who scored very highly on his MCATs, applied to medical school, and was turned down. He was able to prove that students who were minorities, who had much lower test scores, got in, and he sued, basically saying that affirmative action is discriminatory. And the Supreme Court ruled sort of 50-50 here. They upheld affirmative action. They said that Bakke had won, should be admitted, but the Supreme Court did strike down racial quotas. And the difference here is a racial quota is where you set up a certain numeric number of minorities that come in. The Supreme Court said that you could consider race, but you could not use a specific number. So kind of imprecise what institutions are supposed to do. Panama Canal. Jimmy Carter pursues a foreign policy based upon human rights. He's trying to diffuse some of the Cold War tension, and he signs a very controversial treaty, just sort of barely gets it through an agreement of ratification in the Senate. And the agreement is to give the Panama Canal back to the Panamanians in 1999. And this, remember, Teddy Roosevelt's the guy who took the canal very proudly and defiantly and worked to build the canal over the next several years. The ERA is the Equal Rights Amendment, which passed Congress in 1972 under Richard Nixon, and a deadline was set upon the ratification. It needed 38 states to ratify it, and the deadline was 1979, and by 1979, when Jimmy Carter was president, only 35 out of the 30 states had ratified it, and 5 states rescinded their ratification, which was controversial in and of itself. Congress extended the deadline to 1982, but there were no further states that ratified it, and the Equal Rights Amendment, which would have banned discrimination based on sex, it just died. And one of the champions against the ERA was a woman named Phyllis Schlafly, a very conservative Christian woman who led a group called the Eagle Forum. And one of her arguments was, under current law, women were not to be drafted and did not have to go fight in any wars. And after several million Americans men did terms of duty in Southeast Asia, many, with the Vietnam War fresh in people's memory, many people were resistant to the idea that, that maybe the ERA would force women to fight. Keep in mind here, the AP does ask for this idea of synthesis. What is ERA similar to? What are other areas in American history, past or possibly present, which have to do with women's rights? And you can point back to the 19th Amendment in 1920, which gave women the right to vote. You can even go way back to Seneca Falls in 1848. This Declaration of Sentiments, which was modeled on the Declaration of Independence, kind of a protest and a complaint about how men have systematically denied women their rights. But the Equal Rights Amendment does die. The Camp David Accords, this is probably Jimmy Carter's greatest foreign policy success. He brings over the leader of Israel, the leader of Egypt, and after 12 days at Camp David, which is sort of a military base outside of Washington, D.C., he gets the Egyptians and the Israelis to sign an agreement of basically a peace treaty. And Israel agrees to pull out of Sinai and Gaza, which they had taken from Egypt in previous wars. And this is a big deal. Egypt is the most populous of all the Arab countries. And ever since signing this peace accord, Egypt has been friendly and at peace with Israel. And this is largely Jimmy Carter's doing. The Malay speech. Malay speech is this very odd speech that Carter does getting on primetime TV, in which he basically bawls Americans out for their pessimism and for their greed and for sort of giving up. And he's calling Americans to sort of chin up and fight a war, to conserve energy. And just a very odd speech. Some of the things that are leading to this malaise, some problems under Jimmy Carter are, and these are things which you definitely need to know in contrast with the Reagan years. You get a Republican who's a super conservative who's going to work to turn these things around. But under Jimmy Carter, taxes are very high. Inflation is very high. Unemployment is very high. Interest rates for borrowing are very high. Oil prices are very high. As people make more money, they get pushed into higher income tax brackets, which is called bracket creep. So there's this feeling that the Americans are being hammered, and they are in this time period after Vietnam and after the OPEC cartel has jacked up oil prices. On the international scene, things seem to not be going so well either. There's this war that's been lost in Vietnam. Now, to be fair, Jimmy Carter didn't lose it, but he's sort of inheriting some of this frustration. OPEC is running, up prices on oil. We've given away Panama, which is a key strategic military position that we had since the turn of the century. The Russians invade Afghanistan under Jimmy Carter right after he signs a SALT II treaty to reduce the number of nuclear weapons that both sides would have. And in retrospect, this makes Jimmy Carter seem very naive, very gullible. Under his human rights policy, we push for human rights in Iran, undermining the Shah, who was our guy, who was our dictator. The Shah is evicted. The Ayatollah Khomeini, a radical Muslim fanatic, takes over. Our embassy is stormed. Our hostages are seized. And for the next 444 days, we're going to be humiliated in the Middle East and in Iran as crowds chant death to America. Carter is going to send in a rescue operation, a commando team, to spring our embassy hostages, and this commando escapade is going to be botched. There's going to be crash and burning in the desert. Again, Jimmy Carter is going to seem to be incompetent. One of our reactions to Afghanistan, the Carter Doctrine, is that we will draw the line at Afghanistan. We will intervene. We will militarily confront the Soviets if they head south towards Pakistan or towards Iraq or towards Iran, anywhere in the Middle East. The fear is that the Soviets are aiming at oil wells. The Soviets are very concerned about an Islamic revolution perhaps taking place in Afghanistan. So we're going to arm, and this is one of these ironies of history, the Mujahideen, the Islamic extremists who are willing to fight and die for their country. We will arm them, and we will equip them with things like Stinger missiles. And Osama bin Laden is one of our creatures, one of the people that we are going to be backing as he fights for 10 years along with many other Mujahideen against the atheist, Soviet, Russian imperialists in Afghanistan. Um, Under Ronald Reagan is going to be elected in 1980, and he's going to win very decisively against Jimmy Carter here. Americans are tired of Carter and his naivete, his gullibility, his incompetence, his seriousness. And Reagan, a former movie actor, is promising that things will turn around. And one of the groups that helps put him into the White House, 1979, Jerry Falwell, who has a church in Lynchburg, Virginia, a Baptist minister, starts an organization called the Moral Majority. And the Moral Majority is an organization that pushed for evangelical Christians to register and to vote for Christian candidates or candidates who would push for a conservative Christian social agenda, such as banning abortion, holding the line against gay rights, upholding and bringing back prayer to public schools. And this group are going to be nicknamed the Religious Right. Reagan's goals in 1980, he is promising to cut back on government, to cut taxes, to cut welfare spending, and to increase spending on the military. He promises to make America strong again and respected, and the day that he is sworn in, the Iranian government releases our hostages, probably not so much out of fear of Reagan, but more likely to rub salt in the wounds of Jimmy Carter, who loses that election. Reaganomics refers to Reagan's program of what's also called supply-side economics. And this is where you give these tax cuts which disproportionately benefit the people at the top rather than the bottom. And the argument is this, that those who receive tax cuts, the wealthy, the business owners, the industrialists, this will spur investment. They will build more factories. They will hire more people. And the Laffer curve is done by one of the economists on Reagan's team, and this is an economic chart, a theory that says when you cut taxes, you will actually receive more tax revenue. And the thinking is this, when you cut taxes and businessmen invest, that investment will lead to more business activity, more buying and selling, more income to tax, and that because there's more business activity, tax receipts will actually go up because you cut them in the first place. Anyhow, that's the Laffer curve. And remember, the AP again likes you to use this idea of synthesis. Time period where we had tax cuts, where we had conservatives in office, 1920s. 1920s had a very pro-business government under Warren G. Harding, Calvin Coolidge, and Herbert Hoover. In fact, Ronald Reagan put up a picture in the Oval Office of Calvin Coolidge, who was his favorite president because he was so conservative. Remember, Calvin Coolidge has these quotes, the business of America is business, and the man who builds a factory builds a temple, and the man who works there worships there. Economic problems created by Reagan. Reagan, by cutting taxes and increasing government spending, especially on the military, will drive us into the biggest deficit in American history. In fact, greater than all the other presidents in American history put together. Stunning deficit. But the economy will improve, jobs will improve, unemployment will go down, there'll be a brief recession in his first few years. But the Reagan years are going to be these golden economic years that conservatives today will point to what happens when you cut taxes. The Teflon presidency refers to, remember, Teflon is that nonstick stuff you put on a cooking pan, and things happened under Reagan which other presidents might have gotten in trouble for, but they seem to sort of deflect off of Ronald Reagan, one of them being the attack in Beirut on American Marines who were at our barracks there. What were we doing in Beirut in 1983? We were trying to intervene in a civil war and bring peace to the Lebanese. And suicide bombers drive these cars into our barracks, killing 241 Americans and 58 French for that matter. Another synthesis type of a comparison here is back when Eisenhower was president in 58, we also sent Marines to Lebanon to try to stop another civil war there. And remember, the Eisenhower doctrine is that we will stop communism in the Middle East. And Lebanon's a place which periodically, because they have all sorts of different religious groups and different versions of Islam, different minorities, is frequently in turmoil. Another example of the Teflon presidency, the Iran-Contra scandal, a little bit complicated, but sure you can you will master this for the test here. The Boland Amendment had prohibited the president from giving military weapons to the Contras, and the Contras were anti-Marxist guerrillas in the jungles of Nicaragua fighting a left-wing Marxist government called the Sandinistas. And the Sandinistas had overthrown a dictator named Somoza, who was a guy who we supported. He was this dictator, the type of guy that Jimmy Carter said that we should no longer endure because he was a dictator. And what happens is when Somoza is tossed out, these basically they're communists, but they're Marxists. They take over, and Reagan is equipping these guerrillas to resist them, to try to overthrow them. Well, the Boland Amendment says we can't do that. We can only give non-military assistance. What happens in the Iran-Contra scandal is the Iranians, remember the Iranians, are still on our bad list because they had taken our hostages for 444 days. The Iranians are in cahoots with Hezbollah, which is a Lebanese Islamic fundamentalist group in Lebanon that had grabbed a bunch of American hostages over previous years. And through negotiation, the White House was negotiating to give the Iranians weapons in return for working with Hezbollah to release our hostages. Giving any weapons to Iran was in violation of another American law. So you have these two laws here that are going to be broken because we are going to give weapons to the Iranians and they are going to work. Some of our hostages will be released, but more will be taken. That's kind of a wash at that end. But what's illegal is we give weapons to the Iranians, and with that money, we're going to give money secretly to the Contras to buy weapons to fight the Sandinistas. So money is going, weapons and money are going in directions which are strictly against the law. And Reagan is going to claim ignorance. He's going to claim that he doesn't know what's going on here. But really, it's an amazing thing. His popularity does remain high. Walter Mondale in 1984 is going to run against Ronald Reagan, and he is going to stake everything on honesty, and he's going to say Reagan is not telling you the truth. We can't keep spending money without having adequate taxation, adequate revenue. Walter Mondale promises that he will raise taxes, and for this he gets 13 electoral votes to Ronald Reagan's 525 electoral votes. Reagan wins by 17 million votes. Mondale wins one state, and that's the state of Minnesota, which is his home state. And Reagan goes on to 4 more years of being president. The Evil Empire speech, famous speech, which is emblematic of his sort of reigniting Cold War tensions. Definitely, there's not any détente, at least at the start of the Reagan years. Reagan is going to be sort of piggybacking off of Lucas's Star Wars movie here, that the Soviet Union and their Warsaw Pact allies by force are an evil empire. And Reagan is going to build up all the branches of the military. He's going to build up what's called SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative, which gets nicknamed Star Wars, and they're these supposedly missile-zapping satellites, which never actually got built, but we spent billions on this. So Reagan is pushing for the U.S. military to be built and to be built strong. No more Vietnams, no more Afghanistans, no more Iranian hostage situations. So again, reviewing here foreign policy under Reagan, the Iran-Contra scandal, arming of the Nicaraguan Contras, continuing to arm the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, building the Strategic Arms Initiative, at least funding it. Reagan does begin at the end of his presidency. He begins negotiations with Mikhail Gorbachev, who's this reformer at the he's the very last president of the Soviet Union, who's a reformer. The START treaty is going to agree to reduce nuclear weapons by 80%, and that will finally get signed under George Bush, but that does start at the tail end of the Reagan presidency. Reagan does become sort of buddies with Gorbachev. They find common ground. They become sort of kindred spirits in trying to reduce nuclear tensions, which is kind of an ironic thing given where Reagan started in the 1980 campaign and through most of his presidency. George Bush, as vice president, will win the 1988 election. And under George Bush, the Cold War will end with the fall of communism. 1989, free elections in Poland evict the communist government and put in the labor union leader Lech Walesa. And in 1989, the wall will literally be knocked down, torn down, taken apart before TV cameras, and the East Germans won't shoot the people who are dismantling this wall, and West and East Germans are climbing on top of it, and it's just a stunning event. And what this shows here is that Gorbachev is refusing to push his allies, is refusing to use Soviet troops to keep the Eastern Bloc in line. Within a year, all of these Warsaw Pact countries are going to have free elections. And in 1991, the Soviet Union itself will fall apart. All the 15 pieces of the Soviet Union will vote to secede. So the Soviet Union will cease to exist. And Boris Yeltsin will be the first freely elected president of a free post-communist Russia. And Boris Yeltsin will be the first president, and Gorbachev will resign. Why the fall of communism? Why does this happen? Well, a number of things. Gorbachev is a reformer. He's trying to breathe air into this dead system through glasnost, through allowing free speech, and perestroika, which is economic restructuring, economic freedom, and by sort of taking the lid and the repression off the system, things sort of spin out of his control. Some people have argued that the arms race bankrupted the Soviets, that Ronald Reagan pushed the Soviets beyond where they could pay for. Some people point to the failure in Afghanistan. About 20,000 war dead in Afghanistan over a decade, and tremendous resentment in the Soviet Union. Nothing like the peace movement we would have here. It's all underground, but this discontentment is part of what's leading to the collapse of the Marxist government there. The Helsinki Accord, signed under Ford, are held up as a mirror by dissident groups in the Soviet Union. This unwillingness by Gorbachev to enforce control of Eastern Europe, and the Russians are seeing the Poles, and they're seeing these Germans and the Hungarians and the Czechs have free elections and get their freedom. There's a coal miners' strike in the Soviet Union that Gorbachev allows to happen, and the Pope, the Catholic Church in Poland, is very much aided by Pope John Paul II, a Polish pope, and so there's all these intersections here of events which are leading to this collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. When this is over with, George Bush will give a speech he talks about what's called a New World Order, in which he envisions the United States leading the world in a collective effort to uphold the rule of law and not to use force. He's this vision of democracy and freedom and a new world order. Finally, under Bush, you have what's called Desert Storm. The Iraqis are going to invade Kuwait in 1990, and it's going to be an argument over oil drilling on the border between Iraq and Kuwait. And Bush is going to quickly send American troops to Saudi Arabia. The fear is that there's about 100,000 Iraqis on the Saudi border. The fear is that Saudi Arabia is going to be invaded by the Iraqis, and Bush calls this Desert Shield. And as we build up these about 500,000 Americans over the next half year in northern Saudi Arabia, the invasion that does liberate Kuwait, that's called Desert Storm. So Desert Shield is followed by Desert Storm. And this is a huge, huge victory for George Bush. Also, not on your sheet here, you should be aware of a phrase called the Intifada, I-N-T-I-F-A-D-A, the Intifada in Palestine/Israel in the occupied territories from 1987 to 1993, which is sliding a little bit into the Clinton years here. There's an uprising of Palestinians who are tired of Israeli oppression. In the occupied territories, these are areas with several million non-Israelis, non-Jews. These are Palestinians under Israeli rule. They can't travel, they can't vote, they can't go to school. There's restrictions on their work. They can't do these things without Israeli permission. They're second-class citizens. There will be this rebellion. And over this time period, 160 Israelis will be killed, but 2,000 Palestinians will be killed in just this long, long-running riots and protests and resistance and civil disobedience from what the Palestinians believe is just an injustice by the Israelis. And there'll be all sorts of shots, if you're watching this at the time on TV, of the Palestinians throwing Molotov cocktails and throwing stones and some sniping at the Israeli soldiers who are occupying the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Clinton will be elected in 1992. He's going to win an election. He's going to win a plurality. He's running against Bush, who will lose this election. And there's a third-party candidate, Ross Perot, who is running on a platform of balancing the budget. And he's going to convince 19% of Americans that this is the number one thing that needs to be addressed. The government is spending more than they're taking in, and the yearly deficit is adding to the collective debt. Bush will win the election in part because, like Reagan, he's a conservative, and he promises, in the famous quote, "Read my lips, no new taxes." And one of the things that will kill his reelection is he will raise taxes. He will do some of the things necessary to try to bring the government revenue and spending in balance. Clinton is a product of the Democratic Leadership Council. This is a group of more moderate Democrats who look at the horrible losses the Democrats took in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and they're saying, why do the Republicans keep beating us? Why does Nixon and Bush and Reagan, why do we keep losing? And the conclusion here is that the Democratic Party is being perceived as being soft militarily, soft on crime, as being beholden to minority interests. And under Clinton, he's going to pursue a more practical, a more moderate position that's going to involve triangulation. And triangulation is where you're picking that position that's in the middle. For example, he's pushing to allow gays in the military, and when there's this backlash by the conservatives, he's going to come up with this, well, we won't look for you, but you can't reveal yourself, so it's called the don't ask, don't tell. Gays are no longer to be thrown out with a dishonorable discharge, but it's kind of a compromise. Don't ask, don't tell. Clinton is going to, for abortion, he's going to say we need to keep it legal, but we need to keep it safe, but we need to keep it rare. So he's trying to sort of mollify the conservatives. Some things that are conservative on Clinton's part, and he is going to be reelected. He's going to be basically a popular Democratic president. He pursues NAFTA, which is the North American Free Trade Agreement. This is a very Republican type thing, basically removing trade barriers with Canada and with Mexico, allowing products to go back and forth without taxation. Clinton is going to put some severe restrictions on welfare, lifetime limit and how long you can get welfare. He's going to push for the death penalty as a governor in Arkansas, and he comes into the White House pro-death penalty. Remember, there's this contrast when Bush is running against Dukakis in Massachusetts. Remember, Dukakis is this guy who was, adamantly against the death penalty, even when they asked him in a debate if his wife Kitty, if she were raped and murdered, would he be for the death penalty? Like a robot, he stood there and said, no, I am against the death penalty. So here's Clinton. He was acting like the tough guy. He voted for more money for police work. And as a candidate, he argued that there should be a tax cut, which does not happen under him, but he did argue that the middle class should have a tax cut. So these things are all examples of moderation, of the positions that the Democratic Leadership Council said the Democratic Party needed to use to drive a wedge into the Republicans to get some of these conservative Democrats back. Some of the scandals under Clinton, Whitewater. Whitewater occurred actually when he was governor, getting small business loans to make real estate investments that flopped, and the losses were paid by taxpayers. You've got a strange suicide of one of his aides, Vince Foster, which a lot of sort of conspiracy theorists said was done by Clinton or Hillary or both. But the big thing here is the president's relations with several women, most namely Monica Lewinsky, an intern in the White House with whom he had an affair. He denied under oath that he had this affair, and later He reversed position, and he will be impeached by the House. This means he will be charged with lying under oath with perjury. The Senate will refuse to convict him. Again, a synthesis comparison is President Johnson, after Lincoln, is going to be impeached for violating the Tenure of Office Act, for firing Secretary of War Stanton, and he is going to, by one vote, not be thrown out by the Senate. But Clinton is also going to, he's going to settle out of court for an harassment lawsuit by Paula Jones, who is suing him for behavior of Clinton's as a governor. And Monica Lewinsky is going to, bring in the Paula Jones situation into the whole her testimony against Bill Clinton. The Kyoto Treaty deals with the president signing an agreement in Japan at Kyoto to limit carbon emissions to fight global warming. This will not pass the House and it will not pass the Senate because basically it would have involved shutting down American factories or shutting them down until they could put in whatever the very expensive anti-pollution gear. But the Kyoto Treaty is an example of this continuing concern with the environment. And you should know, this is not on your review sheet, but you need to know something about Yugoslavia. It's in your book, it's in your notes, it's in some of the material that we went over during class lectures. Yugoslavia will when it falls apart, it is the one communist country that will burst into a very violent and bloody civil war, beginning with George Bush, and this violence will end under Clinton. Clinton will send in American soldiers as part of a NATO task force which will bring peace on the ground. Remember, in Yugoslavia, the Serbian majority went to war against basically everyone, against the Slovenes, the Croats, and the Bosnians, and the Kosovars. And this is a war that left 58,000 dead Yugoslavians on all sides, and 38,000 dead civilians, including 8,000 Bosnian Muslims who were massacred in a town called Srebrenica, and 2 million refugees, most of them internal in Yugoslavia, but 400,000 fled, largely going to places like Germany. So under Clinton, NATO, finally with U.S. leadership, will stop this bloodshed. And this is the biggest conflict, the biggest murder, the biggest violence in Europe since World War II. Well, I've just taken you through the review sheet here, scholars. Again, if you see me before the test, ask any questions that you have. Look over your review book, look over your notes, look over your textbook, look over this review sheet, and good luck. Signing off from the high school library.